Dear Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to welcome you at PRIO today to this seminar entitled Ethics at the Border, the European Internal External Security Continuum, or INEX for short. INEX is a European Commission 7th Framework Program, and today's seminar marks the completion of that program. My name is Christian Berg Harpviken. I'm the director of PRIO. PRIO, as some of you may know, but certainly not all of you, was one of, some people would say, the first peace research institute to be established anywhere in the world. We celebrated our 50th anniversary last year. On that occasion, we treated ourselves to study our own history in a book that, for once, is actually published in Norwegian by the Norwegian journalist Gudleiv Forr. Not yet translated into English, unfortunately, but that may happen. Internationally, we may be best known for our two journals, the Journal of Peace Research and Security Dialogue, both of which were actually last year listed on the top 10 list of international relations journals in the world. So we're quite proud of that. PRIO's security program, in which the INEX project has been located, is led by Peter Burgess, whom I'm sure most of you know, but the rest of you will get to meet in a second. The security program has really become an important site in the wider European debate on security. Not only does PRIO and the program serve as the host for the journal Security Dialogue that I just mentioned, and for which Peter is the editor. The program also hosts the series The New Security Studies, which is published by Routledge, again with Peter as the editor. It has 7 books published to date. There are more in the pipeline. And the series has really become a reference point in the international debate on security. The latest book, which I have with me here, The Ethical Subject of Security, is also written by the very same Peter Burgess. Starts to become a bit of a mystery how Burgess can do all these things, but he actually can. And the book is fresh off the press, and it is also highly recommended. And I think most of you in the audience here would actually enjoy reading it. PRIO is heavily engaged in various EU research programs. Our research on security plays a prominent role in our EU portfolio. We are also involved in EU projects on migration and transnationalism, on the mapping of civil war. We participate in Marie Curie networks, and we are applying for other grants from the European Science Foundation and the European Research Council. According to the Norwegian Research Council, PRIO is now responsible for no less than 50%, half of the EU projects that are given to social science institutes in Norway. So of course that's also something that we are quite proud of, and me as a director are particularly proud of. So on top of this, of course, we're very glad to note that last week PRIO were awarded another 2 EU security grants. So lets this serve as an invitation to the next conference at PRIO that has to do with security in a European context. The first one is called Tactical Approaches to Counter Terrorism in Cities, Tactics. This will be coordinated by an organization in the Netherlands. The second one, which will actually be coordinated here at PRIO, is called European Trends and Threats in Society, ETIS. They all have these great brand names. So that's the invitation. PRIO's security program, more broadly, is focusing on questions of security, as you can gather, on new approaches to security, as those are driven both by concrete political change and by conceptual and analytical innovation. The broader concept of societal security, not only at a domestic or at a European level, but even at a global level, really sums up what it is that the security program at PRIO stands for. This way of thinking about security is interesting. It certainly challenges old assumptions. The debate those days on the Libyan no-fly zone and its implementation is certainly relevant here, but so is the rather prominent debate in Norway those days about data security. Those are just two examples. Both of them would be difficult to analyze and difficult to comprehend, difficult to understand the implication of without the reference to the broader security debate that we pursue here at PRIO. Some would of course ask how it is that security research belongs at a peace research institute. In my view, it is very central to what peace research should be about in the contemporary world. Unless we understand the dominant conceptions of security, how it is that they are formed, how they shape policy and practice, we can hardly be constructive in our effort to grapple with the very foundations of peace. The INEX project, which Peter, I'm sure, will tell you much more about in a second, has been preoccupied with the increasingly blurred line between external and internal security issues. We see that those responsible for external security are increasingly seeking to locate threats in the internal security sphere. Likewise, we see that those responsible for traditional internal security pursue threats externally, often by seeking to prevent internal threats by managing them at a distance. And this continuum raises fundamental ethical and value questions. What are the essential value assumptions and ethical consequences of this emerging continuum? What consequences does it have for wider European policy and lawmaking? These questions are value questions at heart, and it is exactly with those deeper foundations that INEX has been grappling over the past few years. But now we shall be hearing more about this from somebody who is much more of an expert on new security and who knows the INEX project in and out, both in its internal and external dimensions. So, Peter, the floor is yours, and welcome everybody. Thank you.
That was a wonderful introduction to the project, a wonderful introduction to PRIO, actually, and on an introductory level, there's really not too much more to say. Converging and conflicting ethical values in the internal-external security continuum. It's been partially a challenge over these over 3 years now, just to understand what that means. And there have been a variety of different interpretations. I'll try to sum up a little more tomorrow when we close the conference. But I think one of the preliminary conclusions of the project has been that even though we've looked across 4 thematic areas and 2 case study areas to look at the different variations in this internal-external tension, there's also tensions between the fields of study of security. There are different conceptualizations, there are different definitions, and these not only don't always resemble each other, but they're sometimes contentious. They're sometimes in conflict with each other and causing what you might even call intellectual insecurity at some stage. As Christian said, the INEX was one of the first projects funded in the European Security Research Program of the 7th Framework Program. One of the very first. It was certainly the first to be coordinated by PRIO, and it was really kind of a flagship for the security program. There was a message that I think the political side of the story wanted to get out, that security research was going to carry on under the sign of some sort of value-based approach. And so we were both charged with giving content to this political need, and were assigned the task of being an alibi for the needs to have an ethical basis for European security policy. And I'm not sure how well we've lived up to either of those tasks. INEX had a budget, has a budget. No, it had a budget that we've eaten it up, and with your lunch and now dinner, it'll be right down to the bottom of the barrel of 2.4 million. So what in European dimensions is known as a mid-sized project. It started for the 1st of April, 2008, and it's ending actually. The reason we're having our meeting today and not the day after tomorrow is because we couldn't pay for the lunch the day after tomorrow. The project is right in its very last phases. I should also say that we benefit for this meeting from a generous grant from the Research Council of Norway, a supplementary support grant which covers the meeting expenses. And And I have to say as well that the Research Council has been very supportive all the way through the project, and that's been a partnership that's been important to us. I'd also be, when I'm on the thanks, I should also point out Jonas Grenz, who is maybe an email name to all of you, and there he is. Stand up, Jonas. And maybe we'll thank him tonight, but maybe a thanks just now. He is, as you know, if you're a member of the project, he's actually the genius behind the entire operation, and it absolutely would not have been, with no exaggeration, would not have been possible without him. The INEX project gathers members from Norway, of course, France, Belgium, Netherlands, Poland, Spain, and Turkey. We've had 16 meetings over the past 3 years. We've issued 27 reports, 11 policy briefs, in addition to a number of books and academic articles, interactions that were not required by the Commission in the contract we signed. We've also, quite importantly, engaged with policymakers on several levels. On the European level, the European Commission. We've engaged with European security agencies on a variety of levels, and we've also been interacting with national security authorities in Norway and elsewhere within the project. The project has a structure which is based on 4 themes and then 2 empirical study areas. The 4 themes looked at 4 ways that this so-called internal-external tension that Christian quite well described quite well, the 4 ways, the 4 discourses in which that is played out. And these work packages, these themes, will then structure the program we have for this conference. They are, the first is the common foreign and security policy, the way that this tension between internal and external security changes, impacts the way that we're understanding, general terms, external security policy of the European Union. It's been put into question on the one hand, but also it's been enriched. So there's been very much a blending and a blurring of the tasks of external security agencies with internal security interests. Secondly, security technologies. What are the value premises, the ethical premises of the new generation of security technologies that we've seen coming to life, coming to maturity in the years since the late 2000s and certainly September 11th, 2001. Thirdly, the legal issues. What are the legal dilemmas, the legal contentions and tensions that arise when we try to create an overall security, which I say matrix, system of provision, which both focuses on internal security concerns, what we call domestic security concerns, the domain of justice ministries in different European states, and security as an external problem, threats coming from outside European borders, perceived in a very general way. Fourthly, security professionals, policing. What about this strange and sometimes troubling or problematic mixing of policing and military, which has been progressing in the last 10 years and has become almost a given today? The work done by domestic or internal police forces are more and more mixed up with the work done with external security forces, or otherwise known as military. So we try to look in this 4th area at the value issues related to the shifting role of security professionals. Those are the 4 thematic branches that we have in the project. And then there are 2 more empirical areas where we try to look more closely at the actual way these issues were played out. And one was focused on the eastern neighborhoods, and the other on the southern or Mediterranean area. So the eastern neighborhood in particular, we had case studies on Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova. For the Mediterranean, we had Morocco, Algeria, and Egypt. So as I said, the program today is essentially focused on that structure. It doesn't quite go in that order because of the way that, because of travel arrangements and availability of people, we had to shake up that order a little bit. But it essentially will cover those 6 areas. So the first today will be the work package on the EU Common Foreign Security Policy in the first panel now immediately, and the second will be on the eastern neighborhood. And And the format we've chosen then is to have one or two presenters from the project itself, and then a local, a native commentator to discuss from his or her perspective the material that's presented. So with that, I thank you, wish you a good meeting, and I can invite then the first panel to come up.
This panel is on implementing the EU Common Foreign and Security Policy. And basically what this is all about is looking at contemporary threats, and I'll kind of put my own italics around the word in the spirit of Peter's work. And what this we would regard organized crime, terrorism, state failure, illegal migration, and other themes. And very lucky to have the panel here, and I think the project was blessed with some good researchers, and we'll start off with, not to put too much pressure on, Eva Gross, who is at the Institute for European Studies in Brussels, and she holds a doctorate at LSE. I presume these little bios are distributed to everybody. Just to me, then I will read it. So then, just so you get the full flavor. Anyway, she's been a visiting fellow around Europe and the US, and her current research projects include transatlantic cooperation and post-conflict reconstruction, the EU's contribution to security sector reform in Afghanistan, the ongoing development of European crisis management policies, and the EU's enlargement with the emerging powers. So it's a broad research agenda there. And then to my right is Gunhild Haagensen-Ejrv, who deserves special thanks because she's come in as a pinch hitter after illness and a cancellation. So she was some quick maneuvering by Jonas, and your generosity. We have Gunhild here. And she's an assistant professor at the University of Tromsø in political science. She's taken part in a number of national, international research projects, particularly specializing in security theory and politics, civil-military relations, and international relations theory. In addition, she contributes to the research fields of gender politics and international political economy. And she has a doctorate from the University of Alberta in political science. And then to my left is Pernille Rieke from NUPI, and or in English, which I always forget, and I have to actually read it, the Norwegian Institute for International Affairs. She's a senior researcher there, and she used to work at Norforsk, and is the head of the Department of International Politics at NUPI, and she received her doctorate at the University of Oslo. And I believe she was the local person who's commenting, or is that Gunhild? Yeah, okay. But the person she replaced was part of the project that was supposed to be an internal commentator, so we have two external commentators who are based in Norway. Okay, Eva, it's your show.
Can everybody hear me with the microphone? Okay, because my voice doesn't fit in the microphone. First of all, thanks very much to Peter and Jonas for inviting me, for arranging everything. And then I should probably also mention that I wasn't the only one working on this foreign and security policy issue when it comes to the INEX project, but I took over particularly in the immediate neighborhood. I was focusing on the paper on the eastern neighborhood, but also the Western Balkans, and that sort of signals that more and more the external foreign policy dimension of CSDP is no longer so external, but is increasingly becoming internalized. And I think the premise of the INEX project.
I think we're going to have you do
Yeah.
this.
Okay. Right. So
Put it in your little bag. Be a little high.
yeah, like this.
That's good.
Okay. All right. Okay. Okay. Right. So increasingly, CSDP as an external policy is increasingly engaging in internal aspects of European security. At the same time, we can also observe a growth of the area of justice and home affairs, managing migration, which was traditionally more of an internal security policy, and increasingly these two areas of political engagement, either through CSDP or close cooperation with previously thought of as internal policies or agencies such as Frontex, are taking place. And that raises the questions not only where are we on this internal external security continuum as an EU foreign policy, but also what's the potential for either, what are the ethical assumptions behind these external policies that are now working on issue areas that have internal implications, but to what extent could this actually produce value clashes within the EU's foreign and perhaps also its internal policy. So this was sort of the idea behind this particular work package. Again, the literature review, I can summarize Stefan Davidshofer's work, who did a sort of thorough review of the available literature. And what's really striking there is that, perhaps also because this is a relatively recent development, there hasn't been a whole lot of reflection on either the ethical foundations of EU foreign policy in general, or this increasing internalization of external policy. So you can really sort of take as a point of departure perhaps this engagement with the EU as a civilian power. Is the EU a normative actor? To what extent can it project its value abroad? But very little empirical work on to see whether that's actually the case. There is a small but growing literature on this sort of linkage between internal and external policy, but again, nothing overly systematic has taken place. So he suggests as two avenues for further research. First of all, an engagement with accountability of institutions at the Brussels level that are engaging in policies that are linking the internal and external security threats, either CSDP mission or even agencies such as CITSEN, the intelligence agency. So look at accountability very closely, or indeed look at civilian crisis mission and how they implement their political aims as a means to get at this sort of question whether there are conflicting values at play, and what, if they are, what can we do about it. So the second part of the project then was we divided it also with the help of a workshop in three sections. First, to look at what the actual value premises underlying CSDP missions in general and those in the Eastern neighborhood and the Balkans are. How are they implemented in practice? How could we sort of tease out how these values are implemented in practice to sort of track the EU's records? And then lastly, focus on the ethical consequences in these practices and see whether they are actually clashing, or whether we do have whether the EU ought to really sort of change its course in terms of policies. So I'll just go through all of these three sections one by one. The value premises that we identified are fairly broad. I mean, the EU in its foreign policy obviously has identified a number of guidelines: commitment to human rights, democracy, conflict settlements, conflict prevention. And the European Security Strategy of 2003 places a high value on the rule of law and effective multilateralism. So these are the sort of rather broad commitments the EU makes in its foreign policy goals. Now, when it comes to the CSDP missions, particularly the civilian ones, there has been, at least initially, a fairly strong emphasis on transmitting European standards in police reform, in justice reform, in border management, in addition to the general objectives that individual missions set out, without actually defining what these European standards in practice are, beyond referring back to these sort of broad categories that I listed before. A second, or actually third value premise one could sort of ascribe to CSDP missions is that most of them are non-executive missions. That means they're focusing on advising and mentoring, so they're not actually going in to arrest people or force host countries to change their administration or police laws or whatever. I mean, it's really an advisory function, so one could from then on assume that local ownership is taken seriously as a value assumption. Now, within this sort of specific CSDP and general EU foreign policy framework, when it comes to the Balkans and the countries of the European neighborhood, there are two broader policy frameworks in which the missions are embedded. One is, of course, the accession perspective. I mean, we're in the business of building member states, not just reforming them. And in the Eastern neighborhood, the EU is also acting, or purports to be acting, as contributing to the solution of frozen conflict, border management, justice reform, and monitoring missions such as the one after the war in Georgia in 2008. What's observable there, I think, in this short list, specifically when it comes to the enlargement perspective, is that inherently the value premises that I just listed, that we found in the EU's policy objectives, are slightly, there's a potential contradiction that I think plays out in the policies as well. And that's one between stabilization, that means solving frozen conflicts, solving or building a member state out of Kosovo, or bringing about police reform in Bosnia. That's kind of at odds at the moment, the way we practice it, with the goal of integration. And there's sort of a bit of a political deadlock where these two goals aren't being reconciled satisfactorily, I would say. And the second issue that was a bit worrying when discussing the value premises was that specifically in EU Balkans relations, again, this broader aim of membership building is that one can really see a politicization, but perhaps also more so a securitization of EU Western Balkans relations. So it's become more about keeping countries out than building states, building member states, putting forward or extending European standards and values, so on the political level. So those were a few clashes or contradictions that arose from the observation of the stated political goals and how the missions fit in. Then I looked at how the missions put, or how one could say that values are observable in practice, how the missions are set up, designed, analyzed, and what that means for the value premises that these missions are supposed to put in place, particularly these European standards, and as part of the European standards, the broader political goal that supposedly these missions pursue. One way to judge is, have the missions fulfilled the mandate that were set by the European Union. One broadly can say yes, although many of these missions were sort of readjusted afterwards to fit their specific goals. I mean, when you look at the history of CSDP, especially in the beginning, there was a rather steep learning curve, and the EU hasn't always been able to be realistic about the goals these missions could accomplish, either operationally or politically. So there's a yes, but. On the accountability issue that I mentioned earlier, that came out of the literature review as one way of looking at the ethics and values in external policy, we found that this is a fairly gray zone. because there's not a lot of literature on it. When you think about what accountability could mean, for one, it could mean, are the mission personnel accountable to their sending entity? I mean, what if there's an abuse of office or power? And to what extent are the mission and the mission personnel accountable to the local population? There, institutionally, there's some work to be done both for the EU, but also, I think, in terms of us as analysts. As far as accountability of mission personnel to the sending entity, when it comes to civilian missions, at least it's very much a gray zone with the head of mission and Brussels being able to fire people if there really was an incident, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of investment made in this accountability proponent. I didn't find a lot of any literature really on it, and not very many people willing to talk about it. And when it comes to accountability towards the population, I mean, most of the missions do have a human rights advisor, but it's sort of vague on what that person is actually supposed to advise on and how this advice is then sort of taken on board. There seems to be instead a sort of assumption that because the missions are working towards European standards and broad European foreign policy goals, human rights, democracy, etc., that automatically they'll contribute to improving human rights and in the host population. So I think there's a lack of engagement there. Now, putting European standards in practice, that was another test for these missions. Not only are mission personnel, heads of mission, or actually the larger Brussels crowd sort of at a loss to define what European standards are, except for reverting back to what's in the European security strategy or what the European foreign policy goals are, human rights, democracy, etc. But when you talk to mission personnel and read some of the think tank literature, it seems that a lot of time these standards of the missions are actually invented as one goes along, what fits the host country. It sort of depends what the nationality of the head of mission or most of the relevant advice are. So there seems to be a sort of a lack of engagement and lack of standardization of how to put in practice European standards and how to implement them. So I think there's a bit of a challenge there. Beyond European standards, I think it's also slightly outside CFSP. Well, actually, not really. Often the EU is not the only actor on the ground when it comes to post-conflict reconstruction and its external assistance. So beyond figuring out what European standards ought to be within a CSDP mission, I think there's also a coordination challenge with other actors who might be in the business of doing very similar things, like NATO in Kosovo. The US is an actor as well. Sometimes also the OSCE, and you have situations where there are several institutions and bilateral actors trying to do very similar things to the EU, but again, according to different practices. So there seems to be the standardization process when one talks about values of the EU. One could also define those as going beyond just the EU and its member states in CSDP missions. There's been also a bit of concern when it comes to these sort of values in practice over civil-military relations. That means the division of labor between civilian and military actors in post-conflict situations. And analysts have noted that conceptually and also ethically there could be a problem in accepting a role for the military in law enforcement or police reform. That was something that happened in Bosnia, where the EU military operation engaged in fights against organized crime, or there was also a note that in Kosovo we often KFOR, the NATO military forces helping local police in their patrol. And analysts make the case that specifically in post-conflict societies with weak institution, maybe that ought not to be a role the military ought to assume, but rather something that should be firmly in the hand of civilian actors. So right there, again, you have a potential for value clashes. But I think the most troubling occurrence of value clashes in practice were where this sidestepping of them altogether, specifically in the case of Kosovo, where the EU has launched an integrated rule of law program that is supposed to build a sort of police and reform the police and justice sector and build a border management system. I mean, I don't have to repeat here what the political problems to do with Kosovo are, but incomplete sovereignty, political questions over how to move forward on these issues, problems with governance. I mean, these are all issues the EU on a value level ought to be addressing, including the mission. But what's happened, in fact, is that the mission is now focusing solely on technical aspects that it's supposed to accomplish. That means, building a border management system, reforming the justice and the police sector, without admitting that it's actually by having been launched and acting within the host government, is actually becoming part of the political scene, if you will, in Kosovo. And I do think that that's a real problem, that the longer a mission is in country, to sort of assume that technical assistance is value neutral and not in itself political, to me is something that could over time produce or could count as a value clash, even though the EU doesn't admit that to itself at the moment, at least not yet. So what about the ethical consequences? There we, with the input of some very knowledgeable colleagues who I don't think are here yet, Isabel Ioannidis, for example, who's done some extensive work in Macedonia and Kosovo. I think it's worth asking who these values are for. I mean, are they for European publics, or are they for the local elites in these individual host countries, or are they actually for the local population, civil society? Depending on how you answer that question, you probably arrive at different sort of analytical conclusion of how well these missions are doing. But I think at the moment one can say that civil society and civilian actors in these individual societies have profited the least, or if only indirectly, from the EU's efforts at reforming institutions. But rather, I think the EU is focused on, when we talk about local ownership, on dealing with individual elites, and together with a discourse that's focusing more and more on, organized crime and border management and protecting Europe from these threats from these individual countries. I think this is not quite in line with the values that the EU is sort of at least verbally upholding with these missions. So to conclude, from this investigation of value premises and implementation practices, as well as sort of the conceptual literature, I think it would be an overstatement to say that there are outright clashes between individual missions and their values. And I mean, European values broadly defined in the individual missions. I mean, but what we see more and more is that because these policies are formulated very separately, I mean, the CSDP missions are not necessarily fully integrated in a political structure, or the political end goal is not very well defined, but the mission is launched anyways, as in Kosovo. That's not only a coherence problem in sort of governance term, but it also sort of leads to sort of contradictory practices that could be over time mutually exclusive. So in the end, I also formulated some policy recommendations based on this investigation and analysis. And of course, in the framework of the European External Action Service, I think this coherence challenge is becoming more, but also the accountability challenge is becoming more urgent, because with this new system and under leadership that's even more removed than the leadership previously, as more and more power is concentrated in Brussels, I think it's again one step further removed from the European public in terms of oversight mechanisms. So I think this is something we should not worry about, but bear in mind. So for recommendations, I think it's for the EU very important to, and also analysts, to make these potential contradictions between individual EU policies, the missions, and the broader political framework explicit, and be aware of this tendency to securitize in discourse policy goals and objectives with respect to these individual theaters, and not brush aside these ethical concerns that they raise. Second, I think it's also vital that we have to move away. The EU has to move away from this emphasis on technical assistance and emphasize or sort of acknowledge that even these missions, as technical as the assistant may be, are operating in a broader political context, and that they affect this political concept. And this is something that the EU ought to complement with actually political actions as well. So it's not just the mission, but also the broader policy framework. So in policy conceptualization, this sort of comprehensiveness, I think, is very, very important. And lastly, based on this gap in that we found on the accountability, I mean, both of mission staff, but also staff towards the host population, I think there's a case to be made for increasing attention on values when it comes to training mission personnel, especially at this point where the EU is sort of revising its training standards and actually paying attention to civilian CSDP. I think there's some work to be done on the values implications of these individual missions. I'd like to leave it there. Thanks very much for listening, and I'm looking forward to your comments. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I guess what we'll do is we'll move to Gunhild now. And you want to use that, or you want to use the...
I don't know, is it better with this? Better with this? Yeah? Okay, better with this, yeah. I'll do that, yeah?
Okay.
How much time, actually?
You get 15 minutes.
Oh, God, okay.
But you can borrow some of hers. She ended early.
Oh, yeah.
So.
I might end early, too, being the stand-in. And thank you for that nice introduction. I just want to say I'm not doing this because I'm generous. I'm doing this because I'm going to take advantage of the opportunity to make a plug for future research on the basis of what I understand this project is about. Because just in briefly becoming familiar with this project, there's clearly, if nothing else, a lot of lessons learned here and a lot of directions in which further research can follow. The first thing I have thought about when listening to what you're talking about, plus I read a couple of the reports for the project, is that the way that the EU has been operationalizing, both understanding and operationalizing security, is very much reflected of what I refer to as a multi-actor framework for security. Which goes beyond the notion of individual states thinking in terms of national security, but recognizing different actors that are relevant to creating security in a particular context. And these actors can be both state actors, like policymakers and militaries, although one has to differentiate between those two, as well as non-state actors that can include NGOs, businesses, local populations, media, and so forth. So what these particular missions, and what I found very interesting is that the EU has really relevant and interesting experience, both with regards to civil military missions as well as to civilian-dominated, if not solely civilian types of missions. And it's these lessons learned, I would suggest, that we need to pull forward, as well as develop with the other institutions that are also trying to do the same thing. And what I'm thinking about is like the EU, EU of course, but NATO and the United Nations, because all of these different organizations, of course, are engaging in either civilian-dominated missions or in civil military types of missions. And what is an interesting conundrum for EU countries is that many of them are members of the UN and NATO as well. Well, many of them, pretty much all of them, well, but not entirely when it comes to the UN and NATO. But nevertheless, you have the same people, therefore, having to engage in missions under organizations that have different platforms, different mandates, and different ways of thinking quite often. So what can we pull away with, from the EU to be able to feed into the way that these same countries and same actors, usually the same policymakers and the same militaries, how can we begin to structure the way that they operate that will be contextually relevant, but will also not be mass confusion, essentially, because of all of these different types of mission approaches. When it comes to security, what we're doing is we're securing that which we value. And the values, as Eva was referring to, in general, when we export our values through our mission mandates and also through our practices. And when we export those values, that constitutes a part of our own security. So this in itself can complicate a mission in that it colors what type of mission that we are engaging in. There's some who try to, or who would argue that certain missions are more neutral if they don't have a military component, that it's strictly a civilian component. But just the virtue of our exporting our values has something with our own security to do. And we're exporting our knowledge from experience at home, particularly through this INEX project. So what is the knowledge that's been gathered through the particular missions of the INEX project and the missions that have taken place with the EU? And where is the EU going to go with this? In what way does the EU want to export its values and its knowledge as a part of its own security? We see as part of those values, oops, sorry. Sorry, I'm also being environmentally conscious, with using the computer, that and the fact that I forgot a pen and paper, so I had to use it for my notes, so that's why I'm being brutal to my sign. Yeah, where was I? Taking a look at the types of values that I see the EU exporting, we see sort of national security, of course, still plays a prominent role in our understanding of what security is all about, but there's also a very strong development towards human security, rooted in sort of a human rights focus. We see this not least in the recent invocations of responsibility to protect. Of course, the United Nations had released a resolution, the General Assembly released a resolution specifically on responsibility to protect in 2009. So the UN is more preoccupied with that. Of course, now with Libya, we're invoking responsibility to protect. I mean, this is, within responsibility to protect are many of the values that the EU intends to export. And the question is how? And what I like to take a look at is how we do it on the ground. There's one thing when the EU and NATO at the strategic and political level are talking about responsibility to protect or the types of missions that they're interested in engaging in, but how do we transfer those ideas and those objectives to the people who actually have to operationalize this on the ground? And then I come back to that sort of actor framework of security, because this really does go down to the very people who are creating security on the ground. That would be the civilian actors that we deploy, the military actors that we deploy, and the actors that they're engaging with. For example, non-governmental organizations and so forth. So taking into account other actors is clearly an important step. And from what I understand that INEX has been into, this has been very strongly recognized in the missions that you've described, Eva, that there's, particularly with regards to local ownership, that is a part of a multi-actor framework, is acknowledging the power at the local level, that when we engage in missions, in operations, that it's not just that those who are deployed somehow are responsible for security, but that those at the local level themselves probably have the most or maybe not the most power, but they're the ones that have the best knowledge about how security can be shaped, and that it's that knowledge that needs to be just further supported and empowered by the deployed actors in the mission. This in turn speaks to what you were talking about accountability to local populations. One thing that I think is interesting is the dominance of civilian-driven missions in the EU context, and that these same countries are involved in civil military, if not sort of military-dominated missions in other contexts. So a question I would have is, what can we learn from the on-the-ground experiences in EU missions that we can take to NATO, to the United Nations, to discuss, well, how what sort of knowledge can we take to sort of civil military interaction that's taking place on the ground? Because in this respect, we actually lack quite a bit, and we lack a lot of knowledge about civil military interaction in both the EU context, but also in the NATO context and in the UN context. Yeah, so exactly, that's essentially that which I was most wanting to focus on the basis of what I understood was happening in this particular project, is that there seems to be a lot of knowledge that can be exported now, not just from the EU to other missions, but from this project into new projects, taking a look at the ways in which actors in a security complex are reacting and working, coordinating with one another, and how this also transfers to other institutions like NATO and the United Nations. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Okay, we'll go to our second commentator, and that's Pernilla. And maybe do the same thing with this.
Okay, does it work? Yeah. Actually, I understand now that I mean, your work is much broader in this project than the paper that I've been asked to comment upon, which is more focused on the Frontex operation. So I hope that is okay that I do that. I mean, I don't know if all the people in the audience have read that paper, so maybe, but I will try to be, I hope that it will make sense for you as well. Because the paper that I was asked to comment upon is called the Policy Recommendation Report on Managing the Changing Relationship between CFSP, SDP, and the jurisdiction and activities of Frontex. But it relates to all the kind of broader issues that you have talked about in your presentation. The main argument of that paper, I would present that since you haven't gone into that. If I haven't understood it, if I have understood it correctly, it's that policymakers need to take into consideration the broader political implications of the increasing interaction between Frontex and CFSP, CSDP, in order to avoid that EU's ability to achieve its broader political aims is weakened. I have some kind of, I think I'm not totally agree with that argument. So my comments will be around that. And I've organized my comments in a few specific remarks to your paper, and towards the end I will try to add some general reflections that perhaps links more to the presentation that you gave just now. First of all, I would like to say that I believe that it is a very interesting and important topic to study the relationship between CFSP and Frontex. And perhaps not all of you know that what Frontex is, but it's the coordination, is an agency, EU agency tasked with the coordination of intelligence-driven operational cooperation at EU level to strengthen security at external borders. In studies of the EU, we are accustomed to examine functional positive synergies between policies. We call that spillovers. And this paper, in contrast, examines the negative relationship between policies. And the argument, if I understand you correctly, is that there is a contradiction between CFSP and Frontex. Perhaps there is such a negative relationship, but in order to make I think this specific paper more convincing, I miss an even clearer argument and more empirical data, kind of to support that claim. For instance, is it a fundamental inconsistency in these policies, or is it due to the application in these policies in certain domains or cases? I thought maybe that we could kind of imagine a fourfold table of CFSP and Frontex and separating between goals and instruments, and call it perhaps synergy and conflicts between CFSP and Frontex. And it would be interesting to see where you would put your argument in such a. So I actually made the fourfold table for you. Maybe that could be of some use. Because I thought maybe are there differences in goals or in instruments that create the difficulties that you referred to? My second point relates to the argument that the technical nature of Frontex obscures the broader political framework of CFSP. And here I think that the paper could have been strengthened by discussing the nature of the relationship more in detail. It is obvious that the EU need efficient border control, and the success of such a control is dependent on the development of techniques and intelligence. So this technical focus does not have to be in contradiction to the basis of the enlargement process or a positive neighborhood policy based on the ambition of extending what you call the European zone of peace. This could, in my view, be two parallel processes. Rather, one could argue that an efficient border control is necessary in order to uphold the European peace and stability, and that it is actually a condition for it. So, I mean, the enlargement process continues, but will have its limits, and border control is actually aimed at the border between the EU and third countries. So strict border control does not necessarily imply a negative political relationship between countries, such as strict border control is still a function between Great Britain and France, Great Britain being a non-Schengen country, and also the members of the EU, or between US and Europe for that matter. And the argument that you make in this paper, and that you talked about EULEX Kosovo a little bit also, you make the argument with relation to that operation that it provides the clearest illustration of this. And I have a bit difficulties in understanding that. I mean, I think that EULEX Kosovo will not hinder the enlargement process, but maybe I have understood you. I have not understood you correctly there, because as I see it, this operation aims at assisting, and I quote from the mission statement, the Kosovo authorities, judicial authorities, and law enforcement agencies in their progress towards sustainability and accountability. And as you know, the development of a well-functioning judicial system is also necessary in turn to comply with the acquis communautaire and the acceptance criteria and so on. So I just wonder, is there really a contradiction between state building and gatekeeping, as you argue in the paper? Because rather I will argue that the latter is actually a condition for the former. And thirdly, I cannot see that there is a reason to believe that border security necessarily contradicts the EU's commitment to protecting human security. I mean, the technical elements in Frontex is, as I understand it, partly about establishing good rules and routines that secure the borders, but also provide the migrants certain rights and give them protection from misconduct and random behavior. So professional border control, in my view, must not be confused with hostile policing. Many of the people crossing the borders are also from third countries, so migration flows involves many kind of countries, host countries, transit countries, and destination countries. And many transit countries, which are neighbor countries to the EU and also part of the European neighborhood policy, or even potential member states, also have problems with migration flows. So I believe that the paper perhaps could have benefited from highlighting some of the challenges then presented by being a transit country also. I have to say I'm not an expert in this field, but to me it seems that visa policy maybe, and the cost of visa and the time of getting a visa perhaps is a bigger problem than border control when it comes to kind of ethical dilemmas. And finally, if you can make a convincing argument about the inconsistency between these two policies, I also believe that perhaps the paper would have benefited from some ideas about the solution. Because, as I mentioned, I mean, open borders are obviously not an option. And Europe is in economic crisis. The border control is necessary in order to maintain a credible political union. And the EU's CFSP is still based on human rights and soft power and contribution to stability and peace outside the EU border through various projects, programs, and agreements. So I have problems with seeing the ethical kind of problem here. So I think that these are my main remarks towards the paper. And so as you understand, I'm not totally convinced about kind of the main argument, but it could very well be that I have misunderstood some of your arguments, so you can add to that later on. And then over to some general remarks. My first remark relates to the issue of enlargement as a security policy tool and the power of attraction and its limits. Enlargement is, of course, and has been an important security policy tool for the EU. And still it is evident that there will be limits of this process. The power of attraction will only work as long as the EU is attractive in itself. And the EU is only attractive if it's credible and stable. A condition for a stable and credible union is, among other things, an effective and fair border control. The EU has to be attractive for its citizens and for its future potential citizens. And a flexible border might be attractive for non-members, but members and even future members would probably prefer clear borders. And in addition, the EU cannot expand forever. I mean, there are probably some limits. There is also an enlargement fatigue in the EU, and the enlargement process has to be supplemented and subsequently also replaced by other forms of association processes that have similar effects, like this is already kind of the core of the neighborhood policy, but also conflict prevention and external action in general. And this is all at the core of the EU's kind of comprehensive security approach. And as I see it, there are few reasons to believe that the Union's power of attraction will be reduced by highly technological border controls. It will not. I can't see that it necessarily have to be, the power of attraction have to be reduced, because it could be replaced by these other kind of associations policies. So I think it's rather on the contrary. I mean, it's necessary to have border controls in order to be attractive, have this power of attraction. And my second remarks relates to the challenges of globalization. I mean, it's obvious that the borders between internal and external security has become blurred. And this is first and foremost linked to the post-9/11 security context, but may also be intensified in the future by potential mass migration resulting from poverty, natural disasters, and military conflicts like the ones we see now in the Middle East. And there are challenges that need to be overcome in relation to these challenges. I mean, there are institutional practical challenges such as coordination between different policy areas, such as you mentioned, military and civilian, as well as ethical challenges. But in my view, the ethical challenges is mainly related to the need for intelligence. I mean, a blurred border between internal and external security requires more intelligence and surveillance on the one hand, and that could be a problem for the principle of kind of individual freedom and liberty on the other hand. So I believe that these are important issues, and I think that the paper would have been benefited from engaging more systematic discussion about these dilemmas, and that the paper also could have brought in more empirical data and illustration on how these concerns are actually balanced and handled in a day-to-day basis in the EU. And that might also help to because you make policy recommendations, so maybe it would be easier to make even more specific policy recommendations if that is the main ambition. Thank you. I'm sorry that the comments were so directly on this paper, but that was what I thought I was supposed to do. Thank you.
Review. I wanted to make 3 very brief comments on what you said, Eva, which I thought was quite a bit more mature than the report. And that's why Pernille said it was different than the report. I think then it changed. Really 3 remarkable things you said that I wanted to just point out. The one was about standardization processes of norms in policekeeping missions, and how these seem to be developed bottom up, almost empirically, based on the values of those implementing. Yeah, enough said. I think that's just that makes an enormous challenge for the whole concept of standardization, and puts into question whether whether standardization in a sort of top-down sense is desirable at all. And then secondly, what you said about technical issues, I agree with entirely, that technical issues are often, and not only in policing missions, but also in European security at large, they're also often conceived of as free from value questions. That we're just doing the engineering, we're doing the technical part, it's just a camera, it doesn't have any ethics attached to it. No value questions are invoked, no value responsibilities are there. And this, as you said yourself, I agree entirely, is illusionary. That any technology is already deploying a kind of value system. And then lastly, what you said about non-executive missions. That the police missions at times were not actually implementing, not actually executing. And it made me think of this old Kantian principle, which says that there's no such thing as law without coercion. There's no law without the possibility of punishment. And I thought again of, as Gunnar mentioned, the UN resolutions, 1973, yeah, excuse me, which led essentially to a UN which couldn't do anything and had to be, the actual execution had to be taken up by others. And it's a common critique of the UN that, well, we can't have a sort of universal law or a universal set of principles if you don't have a police. And nobody wants a UN police, obviously. So can there be at all, can we talk at all about the deployment of European values or any kind of values if there's not a coercive measure, if the police aren't allowed to shoot, to put it crudely?
Great. Any other questions? Yeah, thanks. And could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm Kerry Longhurst from Collegium Civitas in Warsaw. I really enjoyed your comments and broadly agreed with almost everything you say. And therefore, taking that back to Eva, this issue about state building and gatekeeping, you say that they're compatible, and I generally agree with that. I think Eva suggested that she thought maybe they weren't, and they're quite a dangerous relationship there. But surely in the case of some place like Kosovo, which you mentioned quite a lot, and that was a big part of your case study, is there not a lot to be gained by specific sectoral, technical efforts on the part of the EU, for example, in border management, which is so crucial to such a small territory as that? And as you said, so important given that these states aren't just aren't at all destinations for migration, but also transit. So maybe it's a value, and therefore we shouldn't kind of make a dichotomy as big as you might have suggested.
Okay, I think that's a lot for you to chew on, so I'll give you the floor. If you turn it on.
Ah, yeah, okay. No, it was off.
Oh, that's
that
why
was
it
the
didn't work very
problem.
well.
Okay. Well, thanks for all. Thanks for all the comments. I think some of the criticisms you raised are in the longer paper that I used, but we can. But there's a few things I think we should discuss. Anyways, the paper didn't make the point that they're necessarily contradictory, but that one has to watch out for the potential for them to be contradictory. So basically, there's just an assumption that as long as everything's coherent, there won't be a value clash, because once all the policies are linked up in pursuit of a specific objective, everything's fine. But the report, both the literature and the findings, stated that perhaps it's not quite as simple. Of course, secure borders are important, but that one still has to calibrate what each of these agencies and policies are supposed to accomplish. So that was the contradiction. On the enlargement, security, and power of attraction, I think that was a good case for saying that there is a potential contradiction there, because sort of building a fortress Europe and managing our borders to our neighbors coherently also, I don't think it's correct to automatically assume that will make the EU for exactly these neighbors more attractive. It could also be that they feel even more excluded, even if they are potential member states. So I think the EU and the policymakers need to manage that message very well. For example, using visa liberalization as a tool for conditionality in the accession politics, I think that sends a very problematic message. Of course, that's not Frontex's fault, but it's part of the broader, border management. Are we securing us against them? Who's them? How can we? I mean, so I think there's a value contradiction there that needs to be borne in mind. So I think just assuming the borders are safe, therefore we're attractive, is not quite convincing to me, at least. But it's not an issue of technology being bad necessarily. On the globalization, I mean, I wasn't suggesting, and the report isn't suggesting, that we don't need to manage migration, or that's not a challenge for the EU. Similarly with the transit countries, but I think we're sort of often in the discourse prioritizing the managing migration rather than treating root causes for migration at their source. So I think when you just only manage, when Tunisian refugees show up at Lampedusa and you call in Frontex, but 20 years of the European neighborhood policy hasn't, changed the structural conditions or foreseen these migration movements. I think there's an imbalance in the policy instruments that we employ. And if you were to make a clear distinction of policy aims, policy instruments, and sort of timeframes for policies, you might not have to secure or put the emphasis on security. You might put it on conflict prevention, for example. I mean, that's where I think ethical challenges or challenges in general for EU policy could result. And the values without coercion, state building versus gatekeeping. Yes, I mean, I take your point there, but I think if the EU claims or sets the standard for itself to be non-executive and advising, I mean, I think this balance needs to, this discourse and discussion also needs to take place in the broader political discourse. I mean, you can't just leave it to the technical arm of a policy or implementation tool, just in terms of contradiction. There was a question on the EU, UN, and US. What can we learn respectively? NATO. I think that's definitely an interesting research question, some of which has already or is in the process of being addressed. I think what you can say historically is that in the pursuit of these European standards that the EU sort of holds high in the mandates and also the discourse, although that has disappeared a bit, interestingly, there was also a sort of effort to brand the EU as distinct from the UN or NATO, as sort of constructing a new actor. So this idea of learning from one another was sort of antithetical. Although we're now more moving into a setting where this coordination and learning from one another is more politically more welcome. But interestingly, not so much, I think, in the geographical areas the reports addressed, but for example in Afghanistan, but also other more high profile cases. And I think there I mean, obviously NATO is a bit at a disadvantage because it's not a civilian actor; it's a military, actor and organization with different sort of assumptions also of how security and reform ought to be practiced. And so I'm not necessarily sure that EU and NATO are compatible. I think it's more a case of where they'd have to be very careful, again highlighting where their different priorities are and goals, and also where the political weight ought to be. Because I think what you see in practice is that in some areas NATO has taken the lead also for political reasons, but that not being necessarily the I would argue that in the best interest of the desired end state, which is institution building and governance. Carry on Kosovo, on this coercion and deployment. I mean, I think in this debate over, Frontex and CSDP or internal, external continuum, and I think that's an argument the report also makes on this question of the political. I mean, it's true that in Kosovo you need a functioning judiciary and police and border mission, but if you're dealing with a host government that is highly problematic in terms of ethical standards and in involvement in crimes, and then I think to just focus on building the judiciary and the police, that doesn't work. I mean, that's sort of, you need to sort of add something else, except for, you need to engage with the governance question, with accountability, and not necessarily, and even if you only picked securing the borders, the problem would still be there. I mean, so I think it would take a bit of a more multifaceted approach to solve these challenges that the EU said it wanted to solve. The report, if the EU had never put it on its sort of to-do list to build institutions in Kosovo, the report would be sort of unnecessary to write. But because this sort of export of values is an expressed goal, I think it's worth asking where the balance is between instruments and also aims.
Thanks. Now am I off? Now am I on? Any other questions, comments? Peter, you want to say something more?
I think there's a few research programs in there from your comments, and I thought it's a pretty broad field, nevertheless. Yeah.
I can follow up on some of the things that you said. The last thing you said about Kosovo. In my view, the EU policy, Kosovo is a potential in the future potential member state. So there you have the power of attraction, kind of logic is still there. So, and it takes time. So I just wonder, what do you mean that the EU? What exactly is your suggestion that the EU should do differently in order to have some improvement in Kosovo with regard to the regime and the government in Kosovo right now, which you are completely right, which is very problematic from an ethical point of view.
Yeah, I think I'm not convinced that the power of attraction is still strong enough, if it ever was, to induce elites to undertake necessary political reforms in Kosovo, but also Bosnia and elsewhere. So I think to just rely on they'll want to join the EU, that's not, to me, good policy, because I think the last decade has shown that something sort of got lost along the way. So it's not just that we're so desirable that corruption, organized crime is no longer more desirable, or ethnic politics or whatever. But to me, it's these are political problems that the EU needs to also address politically with local elites, but also its international partners. So to just sort of emphasize that it's been able to launch a rule of law mission to build and reform individual institutions it's one facet of the larger policy, but it can't be, the main focus. And I have the feeling that sometimes it's sort of this sort of ULEX as a mission is held up as this great achievement in order not to think about, how one could hold elites responsible and how one could sort of break that rather negative cycle that we see in practice. And I think that also includes dealing with governments in the regions as well. So I think the EU really ought to think a bit harder about a regional political approach rather than just the technical assistance coupled with reliance on the power of attraction. Because as you said, also the European citizens, the enlargement fatigue, it's also not a given that we'll actually take them, even if they were so attracted to us that they would make the necessary reform. I mean, if you see what's, the appetite to enlarge further is just not, unless it's Iceland applying or Switzerland, where that's obviously not as contentious. But so that would be my answer, political. Yeah.
Thanks, Mara.
I just have. My voice is so loud. You can't need it. I'm Mara Millie from the Norwegian Police College. I'm doing a PhD on international police reform, and I'm going to comment tomorrow also. But I have just one comment question. Sort of maybe would be interesting to hear your view on this, and that is through my study, I sort of have a question that has a risk. Is that correct? Grammatic term? Lots of times, and that is sort of, I find it interesting to see that all the expertise lies within the JHA in terms of policing, because it's Justice and Home Affairs who has that as their field of expertise. But when in terms of police mission, is CSDP who's sort of conducting and forming all the strategies, is trying to implement this stuff. And you can see on the ground that there's conflict in terms of those two. I know after the Lisbon Treaty they've tried to sort of merge them closer. But could you comment a couple around that? Do you find the same? Or,
I think the point you raise perhaps is, studying individual missions, and the issue of CSDP in general, I think it's sort of striking the level of available expertise and appropriate expertise in what you need, what sort of skills you need to bring to the table to be able to reform or offer advice to a Ministry of the Interior. That's not necessarily a police, a trained policeman, but there needs to be knowledge in public administration, for example. And I think in many, if not most, I think unfortunately most CSDP mission and engagement with the appropriate skill level needed has taken place only in response to finding that it's missing. We're in Kabul and we need someone to figure out the link between the police and the justice sector, and then so this sort of, there's been a real lack of sort of forward thinking in what specific skills are needed, and with the sort of increased effort at training or taking training more seriously. Of course, the hope is for that to be addressed somewhat, but how successful the EU will be, I wouldn't venture a guess right now. But yeah, appropriate staff, not just in terms of knowing what European standards are, but also being able to carry out the tasks that the mission mandate calls for, I think is a challenge, yes.
No, I just wanted to pick up on what you were saying, particularly about, Take two, yes. About the relationship between the EU and NATO, because I think although they definitely operate with two rather different mandates, and one is civilian-driven led organization, the other military, NATO is an organization looking for a new lifeline. And we see that in the way that it's trying to fiddle around with all sorts of new wild ways to operate. So the EU actually has an advantage, in my view, in that many of the NATO countries share those EU values, obviously. And Norway is actually an interesting case in this. You know, Norway is a NATO country, it's not an EU country. Norway spews the values like better than anybody else does, actually. So there are inroads into NATO to try to establish a certain foundation of these EU values. At the same time, what you have is actually desire from the operators on the ground, because I'm looking at what you were saying about the standardization question that Peter was into and that you're talking about, and happening from the bottom up, and whether it should happen that way or whether it should come from the top down. I mean, in a way, it should happen both ways, and there should be a dialogue happening in the middle, and that's what's not happening. That's not happening at the EU, and that's not happening in NATO. There is a desire amongst many operators, and I'm speaking specifically of military operators, in NATO operations, but also those that are engaged in EU operations or in UN operations, to have some sort of standardization, to have an accept for the sorts of values that they are exporting, because they're the ones who are doing the exporting in the end. So there's trying to, I think that is where we really need a project, is taking a look at what operators themselves are encountering, how this relates to the values that we want to export, both as NATO countries and as EU countries, or when we are both, and in what ways the way that they operate can be standardized. I think we're screaming for that kind of a project. Haven't got there yet.
I mean, I wouldn't even. Can I?
Yeah,
Okay.
This is the way it's supposed to be.
Oh, okay.
It's supposed to be
No, I
natural.
think that not necessarily. I think NATO and the EU on paper even share values. I mean, I mean, so I think on that level it doesn't seem sensible to separate the value assumption. But I think it's not just when you talk about standardizations and best practices, it's not so much the operators on the ground implementing specific reform items, but I think it's just the planning. I think it's more interesting to think about what assumptions the planners make on what's needed in individual missions and theaters. And I think that, but there I would actually
I
say
consider them the operators too.
Oh, okay. No, but for me there's a difference
Yeah.
between NATO and the EU, both on sort of short versus long-term activities. I mean, civilian. I mean, okay, in an ideal world where we had the proper skills for advising, mentoring, blah blah blah. I mean, I think the timeline for reforming a Ministry of the Interior, for example, and conveying sort of public administration knowledge is by definition, I think, a more long-term engagement than normally NATO training missions, to the extent that they have taken place, allow for.
But that's why we need standardization for that transfer.
A division
also,
of labor. Yeah, but I think there's a case to be made that they shouldn't do. Not everyone should do everything. It's sort of NATO should be. It's probably better at reforming defense sectors, so it shouldn't necessarily dabble in civilian long-term structures.
Yeah, I don't disagree.
Okay.
But
Okay,
that means why we need standardization, right? So that we know who's doing what and why, and in which context.
Yep.
With European neighborhood towards the Eastern neighborhood, focusing specifically on the three cases that are part of the INEX research project. That's Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova, but certainly, I mean, some of the ideas and conclusions that can be drawn from these sessions can be applied to the wider region of the Eastern neighborhood. So we are supposed to have two presentations on the part of the INEX crew on the research that has been done. As I said, Anya is still on the train, but she will join us very soon. And I'd like to start giving the floor to Kerry Loghurst, who is a senior researcher at the College of Europe in Atolin. She has a PhD in international relations from at the University of Birmingham. And prior to coming to Atolin, Kerry had an advanced Marie Curie fellowship at IFRI in Paris, and she was also a senior lecturer at the European Research Institute of the University of Birmingham and research fellow at Collegium Civitas in Warsaw. So, Clary, you have the floor.
An interesting and very varied work package to be involved in. I think we've thoroughly enjoyed carrying it out. It's been quite a large work package, I would say. There's been a huge number of reports that's been generated over the past 2 years or so, and I guess most of them are on the INEX website. We were tasked to really look at this idea of the internal external security continuum as it's played out on the eastern neighbourhood area, particularly vis-a-vis Belarus, Moldova and Ukraine. Now, this work package runs all the way up until the end of this month, and until quite recently we were carrying out fieldwork in Ukraine and Moldova a couple of weeks ago. So the conclusions, although are, I hope, interesting and quite full, there's still ideas in gestation that we're still working through, which I think is a good sign. Okay, so Anya, my colleague, will be here hopefully within the next 10-15 minutes or so, and she'll fill in the bits which I haven't prepared for, given that we split the presentation into two. So, and I'm going to also use this machine. So first of all, the objectives that we distilled from the INEX programme as a whole. I'll just skirt through them quite briefly. First of all, we wanted to identify the playing out of the internal external security continuum in the context of the eastern borderlands, as I said, in relations between the EU and Belarus, Moldova and Ukraine. We wanted to, as part of this, identify how far ENP in its eastern context, how far it corresponds to notions of the EU being a civilian power, normative power, exceptional power, ethical power, all these well-known phrases that we know. We wanted to identify what the underlying premises were of EU policy in the neighbourhood policy, and to deliver some kind of result or recommendation or appraisal about the premises, about the structure and content of ENP, and to set up give some policy recommendations, which were the most recent paper that we delivered last week, actually. A second set of objectives, which are here, again, to identify some policy practices and devices which the EU uses to try and address the dilemmas thrown up by this practice of EU of internal, external security towards the three neighbours. And we decided quite early on in the project to hone in on the issue of borders, of visa policies and mobility policies that the EU has tried to develop towards the three neighbours to somehow transcend or overcome the tensions of this external border. So that was really the prism that we took to pursue our work package. And I'll develop this last point a little bit further. But just to give you the context, the background in which our research is based, for those of you who don't work on neighbourhood policy in particular, without going into too much detail, the neighbourhood policy, the ENP, is basically the main framework within which the EU develops its relations with its neighbours in the east and the south as well, since around 2005. It is a policy which is very much distinct from enlargement, but at the same time, the EU uses the same kind of tools and methods of conditionality that enlargement uses as well, but they're two very different tracks. Basically, so far, a state can't jump from the ENP track into the enlargement track. That's the main point. When you look at the various ENP documents, the strategy documents, the early conception papers, you see that it's all about, the ideology is all about avoiding new dividing lines in Europe, profiting from enlargement, not creating new iron curtains to divide EU 27 from the rest of Europe. And when you look at the eastern neighbourhood and the nature of the borders between the EU and Belarus, Ukraine and Moldova, what you really see are instances of what you would call hard, soft, but also fuzzy borders as well. It's very much, I think, a mixed picture there, which is what we've tried to understand over the last couple of years in this project. Okay. Just a little bit more about why we chose this issue of mobility and visas as being so important to our work package. Basically, we came to the conclusion that the EU's capacity to have a citizen-friendly mobility policy to keep itself kind of open and therefore have an attractive view of itself from the other side of the border was really a litmus test for the EU's capacity and commitment. And I've just listed 5 points here. A litmus test for the EU to come up with common solutions on cross-border mobility. A litmus test for the EU to become or to act as a true normative power by creating porous borders at the external frontiers, but also to fulfill those pledges that it made to the eastern neighbours within ENP, not to completely cut them off. Also it was a litmus test to find an optimal balance or an accommodation between internal and external security in the kind of INEX definition, but also a litmus test of the EU's capacity to develop a working concept and practice of migration management and an EU visa code, which are very new policies but haven't really been developed on the ground, and we mentioned that a little bit in the panel just now. Okay. So this was something which my colleague Anya was going to give a brief description about, which is just really what we did with the work package, how it flowed over the last couple of years. So just very briefly, our work package comprised numerous workshops, seminars with policymakers at national and EU levels, border guards, various research communities in the 3 countries under study, but also at Brussels level and, as I mentioned, at national levels as well. Interviews with border guards, various other officials and NGOs in all the 3 countries under study, and also site visits to border regions between Poland and Ukraine, and to the more recent local border traffic zones as well, which have recently been set up between neighbouring countries, and we got a chance to visit and to see them in practice towards the end of our project. We produced, as I mentioned already, quite a lot of output, various reports and papers which are all on the website, which cover various issues to do with implementation of ENP, border security, the role of borders in EU neighbour relations, the Eastern Partnership, and to some degree some work on comparative perspectives between the East and Southern neighbours. And we also did, to some extent, some collaboration with Frontex and some early stages in the project. Okay. Right, okay. One of the first tasks that the INEX project set for us to do was to really work out and develop this idea of the EU being a civilian power, a normative actor, an ethical power. And of course this involved, as Eva said this morning, first of all tackling systemic literature review of academic work already out there. So we examined a whole range of literature, and we also brought into focus ENP core documents, strategy papers, concept notes, starting from the very beginning discussion about the ENP from the Solana paper, from Jack Straw, all these contributions from policymakers in the early development of ENP to try and put together a kind of a mosaic, if you like, and from that distill what we saw as being the EU's self-conception and mission vis-a-vis the Eastern neighbours. And this is kind of a bit lengthy, so I won't read it word for word. But basically, within or between the lines of EU documents is the idea that the EU presents a force for good in international politics, that it's a security provider, that it has a transformative mission to fulfill, down to issues like the democratization of the neighbourhood is an EU vital security interest, that the EU's offer is an attractive offer for elites in the neighbouring countries, that these states can be encouraged or tutored to absorb or align themselves with EU acquis, with ENP acquis, etc., etc. Second list. It's just more of the same, really. But this is just what we distilled from the literature review and from the study of core documents and primary sources in ENP. Okay. Just maybe read those last four ones, they're quite important. I think within the EU's conception of itself is that its own offer to the neighbours is much more attractive than what Russia can offer to the neighbours. I think there's an assumption that the EU and the neighbours have a mutual interest in securing shared borders, that there's also a shared interest or an agreement that unmanaged and undemarcated borders are security threats not to the EU but to the neighbours themselves. And finally, that enhanced or better mobility options and people-to-people contacts and cross-border cooperation, etc., are the best ways of building security on the EU's outermost borders. Okay, so that was really the result from the literature review. It's nothing really particularly profound, it's what we can read already, but that was one of our key steps in our research. Okay, the next step we took was required of us in the INEX document, was to look at this issue of what an EU security practice is, in the Eastern neighbourhood. Our task was to identify and define what a security practice is. And we came to this working definition. While an infinite number of laws, regulations and policies can really reside or within this semantic label, we looked at primary sources, discussions with policymakers, with other researchers, to really get to grips as to what this could be about. What it boiled down to for us, and this is to repeat what I've said already, that an EU security practice vis-à-vis the Eastern neighbourhood is all about mobility and borders. I think almost everything filters down to that particular point. It's to do with bordering practices, whether that's to do with geography, economics, or politics. This is a really kind of short summary of earlier papers that we've written. Even more specifically, we found, probably after the first quarter of our work package's duration, that it's Schengen visa policy that is actually at the core of the EU's relations with the Eastern neighbours at the moment. And this is a real EU security practice, which is, as I said, this idea of a bordering practice. And we really think this is the most important, and it became really the core of our focus in our research projects over the last couple of years. This is all about stringent or restrictive visa regulations. All of the three neighbours, Ukraine, Moldova and Belarus, are all on the Schengen blacklist. They have, to some degree, visa liberalisation and facilitation and readmission agreements, and also visa dialogues on possible prospects of visa-free regimes. So there's basically a lot going on in relations between the EU and its eastern neighbours in this area of mobility and visas. And importantly and quite interestingly, readmission agreements and visa facilitation agreements and everything that involves have become what you might call a package deal in the EU's offer and working with the eastern neighbours. You see this, I think, in Russia. This is playing out in Russia as well. And certainly in the cases of Ukraine and Moldova, visa facilitation and discussion for making visa applications easier and cheaper would only come together with the agreement upon a readmission agreement. So it's a package deal, and it's been rolled out, I think, in Georgia as well, and it will be rolled out even further with other Eastern Partnership countries as well. So this really, for us, provided as a nice kind of focus, really, to our research, that readmission agreement and visa facilitation. Okay, very briefly, sorry, this slide went a bit crazy, but it's all there, but just the punctuation. Okay, so basically very briefly, what are the EU's visa policy objectives in the ENP East area? Basically, it's all about, visa facilitation is all about making visas hopefully easier or cheaper or quicker to get for ENP citizens, for Ukrainians or Moldovans. The idea is that visa dialogue leads to visa facilitation, which leads to a visa liberalisation regime, which Ukraine and Moldova have recently been offered, which actually speaks at of having visa-free travel at some point in the near future. It's all about the EU visa code, which is all about common rules and procedures. If someone applies for a Schengen zone visa in the German consulate in Kiev, or the Polish consulate Kiev, or the Spanish one, it should all, in theory, be the same procedure, the same kind of treatment, and the same cost. Obviously, in reality, this isn't the case on the ground, but this is the theory. Okay. Right, so what about the effects of this EU policy? Has EU policy and what has it led to? What's been the effect on the ground? And our point is that there are some reasons to be cheerful. There's some positive implications, but on balance, there are more negative things to say, and also more negative things to say vis-a-vis the normative power character of the EU in this respect. Well, first of all, and I'm being very broad here because there's a lot to say, but it's hard to kind of squidge it into one short presentation. Ukraine and Moldova have had visa facilitation and readmission agreements for a little while now with the EU. If you look at the statistics, and if you talk to people in these countries and talk to officials in the consulates of different EU member states, you do see that there's lots of evidence of there being more fee waivers being given, so there's more categories of people given visas for free or cheaper. There are more multiple entry visas being issued. Okay, so you don't have to go to the office, the consular office, every single time you want a visa, though you get one which lasts for more than one entry, as the name suggests. However, Belarusians still have to pay double the amount for a Schengen visa because they don't have the same type of agreement as Ukraine or Moldova. You had the common visa application centre set up in the Moldovan capital a couple of years ago. This was, and I guess still is, issuing visas for at least 10 EU member states and 2 Schengen non-EU member states as well. It's widely regarded as being a success and an example which will be rolled out in other neighbouring states. The readmission agreements between the EU and Ukraine and Moldova generally seem to be working, but the fact is actually there aren't many illegals or irregulars to actually send back. The amount of traffic of irregular migrants is actually quite small anyhow. Generally one gets a fairly positive picture of the reform and restructuring of border guards in the neighbouring states. It's generally viewed as being in the right direction, but obviously this is just an official comment. And Moldova in particular has been particularly strong in adapting to EU standards in biometrics and border security and various technologies as well. Okay. Some other positive effects, very briefly. UBAM, the mission between the Ukrainian and Moldovan border, is generally seen to be effective on the ground. If you talk to people from the mission, obviously that's what they tell you. But when you speak to border guards from Ukraine, from Moldova, and from Poland, for example, you get a similar fairly positive answer. And I think more importantly, you get the impression when you speak to border guards at other locations around the area that UBAM is very much a positive beacon for reform elsewhere. Obviously, I know there are huge not so positive arguments against UBAM, but this is just one side perhaps of the story. What you also get across the region, and we mentioned it already, is that there's quite a lot of border demarcation occurring. This was one of the big problems that the EU had, that there weren't many borders which are actually physically demarcated in the eastern neighbourhood, and the EU has been particularly strong at pushing for actual demarcation and physical demarcation between, for example, Ukraine and Russia. I mentioned technologies already. And then the final point, local border traffic zones are quite a recent innovation. The idea is to foster cross-border cooperation and travel and people-to-people contacts at restricted border areas between, let's say, Poland and Ukraine, or between Ukraine and Belarus and Poland. People living up to 30 kilometers on each side of the border can, as long as they have a permit, they can travel quite freely, in theory, to and from the border rather than having to apply for an actual visa to go 30 kilometres into the next country. But there are lots of contentious issues there, and I'll talk about them later. So one might say that if you look at this brief set of points, there are plenty of reasons to be cheerful that perhaps EU policy, its objectives in the area of mobility and visa policy have delivered some positive results, and I think that's a fair assumption. But I think we have to go back to, and this is what we're currently doing now, is going back to some of our early INEX thinking about whether it really is a positive picture, whether the developments on the ground that I've briefly mentioned, whether these really show that the EU is corresponding to being a normative power, an ethical power, call it what you will, whether it really fits in with the EU mission and the self-conception that I noted earlier, And really the question, what about the ethical consequences, the unintended, the negative or the contrary effects of EU policy in this respect? Okay. So actually, EU visa policy, I think, is having quite a positive effect. As I mentioned already, if you look at the basic statistics, the most recent statistics, there are definitely more fee waivers. There are more categories of people who are able to travel into the EU without having to pay for a visa. That's the first point. There are also, in general, shorter queues at consulates. You don't have to queue quite as long as you might have done a couple of years ago to acquire a visa to enter into the Schengen zone. And also, as I already mentioned, there are more multiple entry visas being produced, okay, which is quite a big step, okay. The numbers are still fairly modest, but nevertheless, it's, I think, a positive move. And in general, if you look at the questionnaires given to people waiting in queues to get visas, there is the sense that there is more transparency, that people know more what they have to present. They're given a clearer list about what particular documents, what it's going to cost them, what things they have to take with them to the consulate to prove that they can get back once they finish doing their business or travel. So, yeah, it's a mixed picture. That's the positive side. On the less positive side, the same statistics could be read with a conclusion that the EU visa code, this idea of standardising, of making clearer to applicants what needs to be presented, is still under par. There's still a lot of work to be done there. That visa shopping still occurs, that applicants will go to one consulate, then go to another if they don't get what they want, which is normal and natural. I do that. Because as yet, I think the systems set up to track that aren't fully in place. So obviously this is profited from. And also, if you look at the statistics, the recent statistics, you see that despite the EU visa code, despite there being a pledge of common consular training for visa officials, there's still huge discrepancies between, is that Anya? Yeah. Okay. Huge discrepancies between EU member states, how many visas they issue, how many refusals they give, how quickly they are in responding. So despite this attempt at uniformity, there are still big differences. And importantly, you still see a big difference between the newer member states, Poland in particular. They issue visas a lot quicker. They issue more visas to Ukrainians and Belarusians compared to the Spaniards, who are at the worst performers in terms of their response and their giving answers to applicants. So depends which way you look at it, really. There are positive conclusions and not so positive conclusions, but I think overall there's a lack of really bad news. Okay. The Security Mobility Pact, which was piloted in Moldova, I think as well as Georgia and Cape Verde as well, was seen to be an initiative which was to somehow rebalance the overly securitized agenda of migration, bringing more kind of economics development agenda to the party as well. And this is said to be continued as part of the Eastern Partnership and applied to other states in the Eastern Partnership framework over the next year or so. But if you look at the results of that, although the idea was to promote and facilitate Moldovan citizens who wanted to visit the EU to work temporarily, to make it a kind of fairer, more transparent deal, you see that in reality the deal is that only a very small part of the contract is to do with economic migration. Only very small certain types and categories of Moldovans who had certain skills, wanted certain jobs, were allowed to travel. So the whole thing is a bit of a mockery, to be honest, very lopsided towards the EU's interest, but that shouldn't come as a surprise. But nevertheless, the framework and the structure of what the Security Mobility Pact could be, I think is important to bear in mind, and an idea which I think will be continued and hopefully reincarnated into a more fair system. Okay, so I think I've argued that there are some strong deficiencies in EU policy when we look at what the declaratory policy is, what happens on the ground, and when we go back to look at the beginning, what I said about the EU's self-conception and foreign policy identity, etc.
mobility and visa policy is very much clearly and unsurprisingly viewed within a security rationale. And this is in part because, and I imagine it's the same in the southern neighbourhood as well, there's an incredible, profound lack of discussion in the EU more broadly about migration, full stop, about not just the positive elements, but just migration in its entirety. We don't have an internal EU discussion or concept really of migration, and we certainly don't have a rounded development-oriented conception and debate of migration vis-a-vis third countries, beginning with our closest neighbours. And I think this securitized agenda is to a large part because of this lack of migration and development policy thinking. Recent initiatives like the local border traffic zones, which I think hold great potential for breaking down this securitized concept of external borders, are only really bringing limited results. When I visited one, you see some activity, but it's only really about individual Ukrainian citizens buying 2 boxes of cigarettes and nipping over the border and selling them and making maybe, I don't know, €2 and going back. It's not really the same, the kind of fluidity and porous borders and people-to-people contacts. I mean, it's great if you want to buy cheap cigarettes, but it's not really cutting-edge mobility thinking that the EU should be doing. Another point where there's a deficiency is that visa policy and this facilitation, these fee waivers, etc., when you look at the results as to who actually gets them, it's very much, unsurprisingly, elite-dominated. It's people, academics, it's well-qualified students who get the visas, which isn't a surprise, but it means that it leaves, obviously, a whole wave of citizens from these countries who just aren't part of the frame at all. They don't fit into fee waiver categories, and therefore the notion of going to work or live or visit in the EU just isn't part of their thinking. And this is partly, and this is a recommendation, partly because consulates obviously are in the capital cities and in big cities, but there's a whole range of towns and cities which are nowhere near bigger urbanizations and capitals. Therefore, you don't get certain types of citizens applying for visas. Another strong deficiency, I think, in EU policy is the readmission agreements, which, as I mentioned at the beginning, are this part of this package deal for visa facilitation. These are often signed and, just as importantly, continually implemented without proper verifiable checks carried out by EU member state officials on really how good the migration management systems of our neighbours really are, how good and how fair and how humane are their asylum structures and laws and practices, and how good are their basic regulatory frameworks in the EMP states in terms of judiciary. We all know that corruption has become an ever more bigger problem in Ukraine and Moldova despite EMP, and if you have corruption and a lack of strong legal frameworks for these issues, it's a terrible situation. And nevertheless, we have these readmission agreements, and if they're not monitored, we're sending people back into pretty awful situations, which really clashes with the ethical EU power conception. Okay, I've tried to squidge a lot into a short presentation. I'm aware that I've maybe confused or tried to cover too much ground, and I'll finish just with 6 recommendations, which actually form the basis of the most recent report that we delivered, which I think Pavel will talk a little bit about when I've finished. Well, first of all, and these are really broad, and we could go into tighter detail maybe. Well, first of all, I think the EU, if it's going to fulfill this self-conception of a normative power with a real commitment to the neighbours, has to really continue and speed up on the visa liberalisation path. It already offered a deal, an action plan, not a roadmap, an action plan to Ukraine and Moldova, and it talks about, at some point in the future, visa-free travel. We all know that an action plan is not the same as a roadmap. It doesn't give the neighbours a sense of how long, what they have to do to get there. But nevertheless, I think the EU has to really kind of push with that and be a little bit more brave, and make an offer a little bit more clear and give a time frame as to what the neighbours have to do in terms of reform, and then what can be expected as an outcome. Also, the EU should be, or the EU member states, I should say, should issue more long-term and multiple entry visas. This is really important for the conception of the EU being a fortress Europe or not. If you're given a visa to visit just once and you have to queue up again, it's a bit annoying. If you give someone a visa where they can come and go fairly frequently, it's a different kind of reception, it's a different kind of game. I mentioned before the importance of widening the scope or the range of citizens who can readily apply for and get a visa, and that means opening up consular services in other cities and towns and not just capital cities. And this obviously means more intelligent use and more more intelligent use of combining consular services between the EU member states, more of these common application centres that was piloted in Moldova. I think they also need to, one recommendation is that they should expand the scope of local border traffic zones. I mentioned that they're prolific, they're growing, it's a new initiative, and the one that I visited personally, you see these guys buying and selling cigarettes, but I think there's a lot of potential in this for if they expanded the boundaries, maybe taking it up to 50 kilometres, maybe bringing in some bigger local towns and cities, and maybe offering local small businesses and enterprises some kind of special deals to enable them to trade over the border. That might deliver some more substantial benefits. The last point, I think, is perhaps the most important point. This really ties up with the whole idea of the EU as a normative power, the EU being serious about its mobility and visa policy. And this is all being a bit more imaginative and positive in debating the migration agenda, both within the EU, but between the EU and third countries, and with the neighbours in particular. And this is particularly important in the case of the East, and I imagine it's even more important in the case of the South, and especially at the moment, given the revolutions that are going on there. And this idea about creating a more positive notion or discussion about the merits of migration between the EU and the neighbours really has to then find a way of filtering into the ENP action plans to make it actually part of the ENP acquis, if you want to call that, to create a more fair or positive sense between the action plan agenda and what the ENP states want and what the ENP can deliver. Okay, so I've done a bit of a rapid tour, but like I said at the beginning, we had quite an ambitious task, I think, in our work package. We covered a lot of ground. We spoke to a lot of people. We hosted a lot of seminars and worked with a lot of different types of organisations. And I think we're still in the task of really pulling lots of diverse strands together, but I'm quite optimistic, and I think that we have a lot of things to continue with and to say.
Then we go to the commentators part, and we will start with Pavel Baev from PRIO. He is research professor at PRIO, and he is a commentator in international media on Russian politics in Central Asia. That's what I've been said. The light of the projector. And his current research is on Russian military reform, Russia's conflict management in the Caucasus and Central Asia, energy interest in Russian foreign and security policy, and Russia's relations with Europe and NATO. So, Pavel, you have the floor for 15 minutes, and then we'll follow with the next commentator.
I will try to be shorter than
okay.
15. But let me start saying it's my great privilege of partaking in this event, and I'm very glad about the opportunity to contribute to INEX, which I think is doing a great job and really is a cutting-edge project. Saying that, I would probably have to say that this particular package in the INEX, Eastern Neighborhood, is probably one of the most fascinating. The political initiative of Eastern Neighborhood as a subject of research, I think, is just offers amazing opportunities. In political sense, it's probably not that interesting. It's barely alive. But as a research topic, you probably will never see a political initiative launched with a great fanfare, which in the course of 4 years was changed around at least 4 times, completely. And probably the starting point in 2008, which really propelled the whole initiative very high, was the Russian-Georgian War. And that put into the very center of the eastern neighborhood the problems of hard security. And then came the Russian-Ukrainian gas war, and that added a huge dimension of energy security. And then came the elections in Ukraine, which led to the defeat of the Orange Coalition, fair and square defeat, which was a huge disappointment for the European Union, and at which point the whole democratization, transformation agenda is really deflated. And then came later, last December, the elections in Belarus, particularly brutally rigged elections, which essentially resulted in ostracizing of Belarus, cutting it out of every contact with the European Union, which essentially means that the whole area of eastern neighborhood has changed. So these changes inside the eastern neighborhood were also going in parallel with changes in the European Union, and I agree completely that looking at the policies, you have to start with the question: what is the EU? What is the how you say, self-conception and mission? And the trick is that it's not a fact; it's a process. And EU started the eastern neighborhood with one self-conception and mission, and is now in a very different self-conception and mission. So it thought it will be doing a lot of kind of positive things in that area, and it ended up doing a rescue package for Latvia, for Greece, for Ireland, now for Portugal, and there is no end to that. There is a colossal shift of attention towards domestic agenda. So in fact, each year in the eastern neighborhood, you saw the kind of the resources and the political attention was kind of going down by half. It was kind of half that in its second year, half of that in the third year, and now we probably will see a deeper cut because of the revolutions in Northern Africa, which require great shift of attention from the eastern neighborhood to the southern neighborhood. You cannot argue about that. It's a fact which is already happening. So we have not only changes in the area, but we had changes in the EU ability to manage things there, which were not shifting back and forth, which are going only in one direction. Less and less and less and less, and probably will be even less. It's very possible to extrapolate this trend further. There is hardly anything which might change it. And looking at the combination of these two, we probably can come to the conclusion that it's not probably entirely correct to define the topic of your research, this focus on the visas and migration and managing of these issues, as a litmus test. Because, as you say, a litmus test of EU resolve and capacity to deal with the whole, there is no resolve, there is no capacity, it's clear for everybody. This is not a litmus test. This is the only thing which is there. It is the main content, which essentially means that your topic is more important than just litmus test, because this, in fact, is the only game in town. And this decides whether the whole thing is still alive or is it completely dead. This is more than just, you can sometimes fake your litmus test, but this you cannot fake. It's either there or it's not. That's why it's so central, and it is so crucial. Probably another issue I would like to take with you a little bit, and again, you might say it's my parochial point of view, which it is about Russia. Because in the course of this Eastern Neighborhood initiative, changes were very clearly also involving Russia. And immediately after the Georgian War, there was a very strong sense that we need to offer a different alternative to the States. We need to, in fact, to compete with Russia. And some reflections of that are here in your paper, when you are saying that adhering to Eastern Neighborhood involved an explicit choice from the States in favor of EU rather than Russia. And that was the very strong initial premise, that we need to compete with Russia in this area, which in fact exhausted itself sometime around Ukrainian counter-revolution. And the new proposition was, we do not compete with Russia. We need to do things together with Russia there. There is no point in competing with Russia. And probably even this has now exhausted itself, because the new probably motto, and that change was very much again about the whole pattern of EU relations with Russia, which after the Georgian war was, we will not have a business as usual, and a year after we will have a business better than usual. Let's close the page, let's forget all these misunderstandings, let's move on with partnership for modernization and so on. That was a period of somehow 2009 and to 2010. What we have now is, I think we cannot compete with Russia in this area. It's just not about whether there is a point in competing, it's just there is no capacity for competing. Russia is far stronger, which is not in fact a testimony of how strong Russia is, but how weak the EU have become in this area. The point here is that I would probably argue against your point that ANP is the EU's main framework for relations with its neighbors. Russia is a neighbor. And of all these neighbors, probably relatively, what is ANP and what for EU is importance of Russia. You look at them, it's hard to say which is more important. Again, I am parochial here, I will not draw any conclusions. But what is specifically important for you is Russia is very actively playing in this very field, in visa, in demanding from the EU a visa-free regime, in kind of playing a visa-free game with other states around. And it's not that just, it's outside your paper because it's a different topic. When EU is negotiating with Ukraine on that, it cannot ignore Russia, because Russia is putting it under so great pressure that even offering Ukraine a little bit more than they're offering Moscow creates a problem, inevitably creates a tension, and offering that to Russia, yeah, well, it's a long stretch. That's why it really impacts on the whole topic of your paper. And finally, my probably last point here is about whether there is an eastern neighborhood. You generally focused on the half of it, on the eastern half of it. And it's not just you are taking a case. In fact, you can see that the whole eastern neighborhood, there is a split, because the Caucasus is there, the eastern neighborhood is here, and what sort of policy EU had in the Caucasus, in fact, has evaporated. Even the position of the EU High Commissioner for the Caucasus is now cancelled. There is no policy there. Again, Armenia and Azerbaijan are locked in their conflict, and the U.S. attempt to break the deadlock with the help of Turkey generally failed, and Georgia has its own special case. So that part, the EU is doing very little, if anything, there. And in this part, which you are doing, again, Belarus is on ice completely. Ukraine has, after the Orange Counter-Revolution, is a partner with which the Brussels has a lot of reluctance to deal with, which leaves you Moldova. You say, what is Moldova? But in fact, I would try to, adding on an optimistic note, would say it's possible to make a success story out of Moldova. And there is a need in the success story. Otherwise, the whole thing is dead on arrival. And yes, EU was scared to death when there was an unrest in Chisinau after the elections in mid-2009, and they were looting the parliament and raising over the parliament the flag of the European Union. Not a good idea. So it was don't want this Moldova at all. But well, time has passed, and that episode has become a little bit of a history now. Other revolutions have happened, and far more exciting than that. Moldova is just about a place where, with the resources available, it's possible to achieve something, and probably more than just with visas. Even the conflict there is ripe for resolution, and Russia is not particularly interested in keeping it going. And there were some interesting exchanges between Merkel and Medvedev about trading this off for this and that. So I think focusing narrowly Eastern neighborhood policy on Moldova and making from that a success is still possible, is still a way to achieve a modicum of success of the whole enterprise. Thank you.
you, Pavel. Now I give the floor to, or you have this too. To Krista Stuve. She is associate professor at Lillehammer University College, and she's currently responsible of modules on international politics and international political economy. Before taking up her current post at Lillehammer, she was a postdoctoral researcher at University of Tromsø, and her main research interests include security, Russia, again, and violence against women in international politics. So you have the floor.
Thank you. To begin with, I also find this project in your reports very, very interesting. I've seen 3 of your reports actually, and they're extremely detailed. A lot of information on the practices that are ongoing, and I have tried to get the main sort of assessments that you've made on a broader level. Sort of in my comments, I kind of guessed that Pavel Bav would be very close to the empirical developments in the field, and my sort of input and my comments to your paper is making use more of security concepts to try and comments on some of your overall conclusions or the assessments that so far that you have developed. Can you hear me? Is this okay? Good. So first of all, I actually like to spend some time of this overall assessment of the European neighborhood policy in terms of the consequences of the security dynamics in the East, and then go into sort of what I think security theory might sort of can contribute to make some of the conclusions clearer. So as you said in your presentation, that was actually very close to the reports, I think, at least to your final report. We gave a very good overview of the whole development. One of your main points is that visa policy is a security practice. That is what you are very much focusing on. And it has then the effect that it demarcates boundaries inside and outside the Union. But you do explain in very much detail in your reports that there has been a clear development of various practices that make this development more complex. It's you have the local border traffic zones, the LBT set, and you have the general trend towards liberalization, so that there is this complex sets of schemes and devices that sort of does make the whole visa policy issue quite fuzzy. But still, sort of, so you make the point that this hardens and softens borders at the same time. You suggest then that this whole idea of Fortress Europe is, through that practice, nuanced. But the way I understand your report is that you uphold this whole idea of Fortress Europe even in the East. And that is something that I would like to sort of question a little bit. Sort of, empirically, you seem to describe that the whole idea of Fortress Europe does not really weigh in the East. There is a bit of a, it's not such a big fortress in the East. So that sort of triggers the question, so how can we qualify that? How can we actually then describe it if not using sort of the fortress idea? So it is challenging to describe then the internal security continuum in the East, it seems to me. And I think that the whole use of this idea of securitization and securitization of migration, you, for example, make the point that securitization of migration is less visible in the East than in the South. But that makes me a bit curious to what does that really mean? And then also, what does the term securitization do here when we still uphold, or when the term is still used in the East, but it's less in the South, and it confuses me a little bit. And also the term here seems to be used, the term securitization, seems to be used metaphorically. It's not used, if we think about securitization in the Copenhagen school approach, where it would sort of be used analytically to examine political developments, where you sort of have a point where securitization really is present. It seems in your report that securitization is used more metaphorically, and I think that hinders sort of the qualification, the description of the other trends that you're describing empirically in the East, that there is here a lot more liberalization. There is a tendency of these local border traffic zones, right? So so I'm a bit curious here if the whole idea of securitization, the way you use it, if that distracts from the real challenge here of describing what you are empirically observing. I mean, you can say that that's an unsatisfactory comment because it sort of returns again to the question of what is security, right? But at least I would like to posit that to you. Okay, so just to sum up that comment then, is that since there is less securitization of migration in the East than in the South, is it then still a securitization of migration in the East? And how can you, or how can you better characterize this security logic, the way you're describing it in terms of the Eastern development in the eastern part of the European neighborhood policy? Okay, and then sort of I suggested at the beginning that I would sort of go even try to make use of security theory, and I would like to sort of put up then sort of a human security framework and this idea of security as emancipation from the critical security approach that are often used. In your presentation, you also talked about the European Union as a normative power, and that it provides security to those who adapt to EU conditions, and the aim of the EU policy is to spread the benefit of economic and political cooperation in the neighbors in the East, as you write in your report. And this, of course, resonates well with the human security agenda of freedom from fear and freedom from want. So the European neighborhood policy is clearly then within this broader security agenda, although the term human security is not, at least the way that it is presented in your report, not actively used. One of the questions that you focused on in the reports was also then the negative impacts on the European security practice toward East. And you ask in what ways the European neighborhood policy contributes to diminishing security on the other side of the border, and how that diminishing of security on the other side of borders can have consequences for the European Union, right, for security in the European Union. And here I think that the human security perspective can actually sort of help a little bit, maybe, because it sort of triggers or sort of introduces the questions then of consequences for whom, sort of who is experiencing a diminishing of security, and how are they experiencing this? So here is my push to be more empirical. Can you be more empirical to actually say something about this diminishing of security? Another thing that I think is missing then here in the report is, and in this discussion that you have on the European Union as a normative power, is the whole idea of legitimacy. So what is actually going on here with the legitimacy of the European Union, also in terms of being a provider of security? And I think that sort of also picking up on Pavel's point here, that the European Union has slowly realized that it cannot compete with Russia. It needs to find a way of dealing with what Russia is, the way it is, whatever it is. And the question here is, when you introduce sort of, when I'm thinking of legitimacy in this problem, it sort of becomes clear that the diminishing of security on the other side might be sort of much greater problem for the EU. It delegitimizes the EU. And here also, I'm just curious, sort of how do you, can you sort of explain and comment on how security and legitimacy sort of links here to an internal and security continuum in the East? Okay, and then sort of this concept of emancipation from, I think this can maybe also make this problem of legitimacy even clearer than, because, you know, security as emancipation sort of introduces this idea that security is something that you strive to through working against power as domination, right? And your research has very interestingly shown how the EU sets conditions, and, you know, the whole visa policy regime is based on how the EU asked the other states to, you know, link to their requirements. Again, sort of vis-a-vis the Russia, where the EU then here considers itself sort of better. This emancipation approach sort of shows that this is clearly problematic, because it provides emancipation provides greater resources to actually the resources that these countries in the East have on their own, and they can probably make use of their resources just as well by coupling up with Russia as with the EU, right? So this whole idea of positing Russia as the other will, for the EU, provide greater attention then. This is also, of course, a potential problem for Norway. You know, the way they are dealing with the Schengen border in the north, and the way they have to deal with Russia. If Norway has to sort of, they are pursuing this policy where Russia is someone they want to be friend with, but having to link up with the EU, where that is more unclear, is problematic for Norway. I think I'll end there.
Thank you for both of you for reading our work so thoroughly. Thank you. There was a lot of reports issued, as I mentioned before. A lot of writing was done. Hopefully, I'm glad it was read. That's really good. Yeah, kind of going through some of your comments. I'll just cherry pick maybe the easier ones, because there were some very tricky things that will take some time for us to think about, and how we'll address them. I'll start with the question about Moldova. What I was talking about, and what my knowledge really relates to, rather, is more the common consular service that was created. I'm not quite sure how broader its remit was beyond the actual coordination and joint issuing of Schengen visas to Moldovan citizens. But I'd be interested to learn more about other joint endeavours. And I think, obviously, what we have to remember as well is that although these were EU Schengen visas, or visas issued to visit the Schengen area, the cooperation in these offices, it involves EU member states. It's not, a kind of commission-led endeavour. It's the EU member states who have agreed or sanctioned each other to issue visas in their name, so that there's a bit of a difference. So the question about legitimacy and who's doing this isn't quite the same when it comes to this common visa application centre, I think. Taking a step back, the next question about the lessons being drawn from the southern neighbourhood. Absolutely. I mean, I just wrote a piece about the Hungarian and Polish presidencies of the EU this year, and if you take things back a few months, you see these great expectations that the Hungarians and Poles would take the year ahead, with Eastern Europe, and this would be a year for the Eastern neighbourhood. And then with what happened in the other side of the Mediterranean, things I think are very much quite different. I think the lessons learnt for the Eastern neighbourhood, and for those member states who perhaps kind of prioritise that part of Europe, is that they have to have proposals and schemes which are very modest, which are using
making the most of existing EMP funds and not grand new schemes, not grandiose, but rather focusing on schemes like mobility and visas, which are at least promised to give some tangible results. I think that's the way things should be focused on. You said lessons learnt from what's happened in the south or the east. Is that what you? Yeah. I think the two sets of neighbours, and I'd be interested to what colleagues will say tomorrow, is that there are huge divergences. There are similar themes, corruption, lack of democracy, etc. But I think there are more that divides them than unites them in terms of their interests for the EU, which is why I think it's important to keep a fairly to keep EMP as the overall frame, generally speaking, but then to have particular schematic or thematic issues which perhaps hit, both sets of neighbours. But it's something that I'm thinking about a lot at the moment, and we could maybe talk about it later. Okay. The questions about the kind of more conceptual, theoretical aspects of your presentation, I agree. I think that's one of the, I won't say it's a weakness, but I think it's one of the issues in our work package which we're coming to meet head on right now. I think ours was very much empirically loaded work package. I think it involves a lot of field work, of documentary analysis, let's say, and I think now we're hitting those kind of questions that you mentioned. I'm particularly interested in your point about the use of securitization, because this was very much pronounced in the original INEX application, and something which kind of, I think, drove us along. I'm aware that, I think we've used it just metaphorically as a label, but I think it still gives us some kind of purchase to develop our ideas more. We've had a lot of our conclusions. You mentioned diminishing security on the other side of the border. You drew out really very nicely, I think, some of our conclusions. You made them sound much more concrete and profound than I think we realised at the time. And so you're, referring to legitimacy, referring to human security, security's emancipation, which reminds me of my master's degree a long, long time ago, are things that I think we can take our empirical work now and reflect upon, and I'd like to have a further discussion about that. So I can't say much more on that, I'm afraid, at the moment. I was encouraged by Pavel's note about it being more than a litmus test, but life or death. That's really great that we're, contributing the research which is as important as that. And I think in many ways it is, because mobility options, visas, freedom to travel are the real things. They're the real things that affect, our lives and the individual lives of, of people living the other side of the EU's borders. So it's good that we have confirmation that our focus on mobility has proved to be quite interesting and of use. Do you have anything else to Russia? A lot to be said about Russia. The thing about the EU offering an alternative, I think you're absolutely right that a few years ago there was the notion that there's a shared neighbourhood, there's a Russian kind of sphere of influence, there's an EU potential sphere of influence. I think this has changed over time for various reasons. But what's interesting, I think, from our perspective right now, and I think that you kind of hit upon this as well, is that what exactly is the Russian offer to a Ukrainian citizen, to a Moldovan citizen? There are political realities. You can wave a European Union flag and you can be in support of Moldova joining the EU, but if the reality is, if you're a Moldovan citizen and you want to, for an economic reason, go and work abroad, it's much easier to go to Russia, right? You don't necessarily have to have a separate working document. You don't necessarily have to have a proper passport. There's different kinds of modalities to travel. So I think this relationship on these particular issues between the EU and the neighbours, and between the Russia and the neighbours, is something that we've got to explore a little bit more and to take account of. I'm aware that I haven't answered or dealt with the more tricky questions that you pursue, but they're going to take a while to digest and to think about.
We have one question there.
It happens that I'm probably the only one representative from the other side. I'm just ambassador of Ukraine. So I found all probably speakers with very informative and in general very objective analysis of the processes. But speaking about conceptual approach, understanding, I think it could be disputable at least to compare Eastern neighborhood policy towards the visa questions, visa policy, and also some rulings or just messages to the annual plans. It's different. Annual plans, it's in line with the agreements with the European Union. But in general, you are quite right. But speaking about some ethical problems, in particular for security and Eastern European dimension, if it's possible to say, for people of Eastern Europe, it seems to me the main threat and challenge was with the extending of the European Union conception as a whole, not to see a new kind of the iron curtain on the border. That is the main. And that is why all those spectrum of negotiations with the European Union looking for just find the ways on our just probably processes to come closer and closer to each other. With the European Eastern European policy, the beginning and the main articles were speaking about some kind of the economical approach and to introduce more transparent, clear regime on the borders. That is, of course, and that is why visa policy is important. But again, in comparison to the South and to the East, South is looking like more equal or some kind of the homogeneous number of the countries. With the Eastern different levels of the attitude with the European Union and different challenges. For example, for Ukraine, we understand only one and recognize legally only one citizenship. Should be only Ukrainian, no double citizenship. But for Moldova case, it's more because they are quite eager with some kind of the different passports, and they are more open for the to visit European Union through the Romania border or some others. With our eastern territories, more just problems with the challenge with introducing Russian passports. So it's just to show that different matters and different problems are challengeable with the dialogue with the European Union on each country level. And again, the main task, and it seems to me the main, at least for us understanding, this is introducing 4 freedoms for people, and at least to see this in the prospect, in the nearest future, or just visible future. And then psychologically would be everything all right, and visa concepts and visa regimes, they will come. Ukraine introduced open visa regime for more than 50 nowadays, about at least for all European Union countries and some others, from the 2005. And that is also, and people inside the country could ask, okay, we introduce open regime, but for us, there introduces some limits. That is some kind of the psychological approach. So again, with the 4 freedoms will appear more free regime and full understanding of the freedoms in Europe.
Thank you, Ambassador. Any other question? One comment? No, you can.
I was just very curious about these local border traffic zones that you also talked about in your presentation. One of the recommendations, if I remember correctly, was to actually expand the local border traffic zones from 30 kilometers to 50, right? But your assessment is that they don't really matter in terms of economic effects?
Yes and no. I think the point is that they could, they could be better
if you expand them.
In some cases, yeah. If you look at the map, if you look at maps of the region, you could see where. I mean, how many are there now? 23? I don't know.
But sort of, but if you can, well, but sort of my question is, okay, well, that's an important point, right? Sort of the effects, the way you can measure them. But that, what is the effect of local border traffic zones in terms of sort of symbolic sort of effect that they have in terms of addressing cross-border migration and in terms of security then?
Well, I think they'll matter more or less depending on the zone is clearly. They're new, so I don't know a great deal, but from the one that I witnessed, it's pretty derisory. It's pretty for a lot of administrative effort and monitoring and the issuing of actual cards. A few people crossing each day, it's a bit sounds ridiculous. But if they're targeted, you look at a region perhaps between 2 or 3 countries inside and outside the EU, where perhaps there are families split across borders, where perhaps there are particular businesses which could profit from different kind of costs of labour costs on each side of the border. If you're maybe with some imagination, they could become the kind of active border zones which perhaps they were before EU enlargement occurred, to try and capture that back. Because if you look at well, as you know, before EU enlargement, some points on the Polish-Ukrainian border were, historic areas of, well, there weren't even borders in the past. They were, active areas of prosperity and economic activity. And these were crushed in many ways, and now they're impoverished. It's the reason why cross-border crime is a problem, because they are, they've been deconstructed in many ways. The local border traffic zones have the potential, like I said, if they're properly applied and thought about, to re-enliven such kind of zones. But just by choosing a place on a map like this, it might have nil effect, So they're an interesting initiative, I think, to watch, and they could be, bring some kind of prosperity back to some regions.
And this is also the case between the relations with the EU and Russia, because there is going to be the local border traffic zone, or there already is. However, the case with Kaliningrad is that why is it 30 kilometers, not 70, for example, which would make the whole region basically. So this is a large discussion that is taking part at the moment, if dividing it into a half makes sense or not. So this we will be witnessing pretty soon, I guess.
Thank you. So I don't see any other. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe just a final question, or maybe not more questions, but all this Schengen stuff, I'm sort of wondering, is this about conditionality, or is it about coercion, external coercion, if you like, or is it about cooptation? So I'm just wondering what category the visa liberation regime fits in, and I'm just remembering Helen Wallace's and my own outcry when in 1997 with the Amsterdam Treaty, through the Schengen Protocol, the whole Schengen acquis was incorporated into the Treaty in the European Union, but with no voice whatsoever for the new member states. They had to basically swallow the whole Schengen acquis without being given any opportunity to renegotiate the terms, including, of course, those on visa and asylum policy, which, in my view, is even worse than carrots and sticks. This is coercion. I mean, if they didn't accept and adopt the Schengen acquis, they were not given the possibility of actually entering and exceeding the European Union. So I'm just wondering, what kind of policy is this? Maybe it's not relevant to answer it, but
No, I think it's highly relevant, and I think on balance, you could say, well, in part it's coercion, in part it's conditionality, in part it's cooperation, but I think on balance it is more to do with coercion. If you look at the EMP literature, the documents, you see, at least in the East, maybe it's different in the South, much more of an emphasis upon adopting integrated border management, adopting all these kind of Schengen level regulations, which for these authorities in these countries is extremely hard and costly. But it is being forced, I think, more and more strongly with greater might, and only then will other ENP deliverables be realised. But the balance, I think you're right. It's coercion, yes, definitely. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll resume tomorrow at 9:45, if I'm not wrong. So have a nice evening all. Okay.